When the most powerful men in England wanted to sin, they didn't go to a brothel. They went to a convent, paying the prioress with their signet rings. Her nuns offered a carnal salvation, but this salvation often came with a consequence 9 months later. For that, the prioress had a final, horrific service, a secret she buried, over and over, in the holy ground of her own garden. In the year of our Lord 1496, when autumn had stained the leaves of the Cambridge woods the color of old gold and blood, a man in dark clothing entered the cell of the Prioress of St. Radegunde. He was neither priest nor monk. A hood concealed his face, and his movements were as silent as those of a nocturnal beast. The air grew still and heavy with his presence, the scent of damp wool and the cold night air clinging to his form. He moved not with the hesitation of a visitor but with the purpose of one who knew his destination and the nature of his welcome, his feet making no sound upon the worn stone flags. He left a small but heavy purse on the roughly hewn table, its leather surface dull in the fading light. Then, just as soundlessly, he vanished back into the gathering dusk, a shadow melting into other shadows. The prioress, a woman whose eyes held the memory of more winters than there were wrinkles upon her face, did not move. She remained seated, her spine rigid, her hands resting in her lap, a statue carved from patience and secrets. She watched the space where he had been, her gaze unwavering, as if she could still see the imprint of his darkness upon the air of her sanctum. She did not touch the purse until the last ember of sunset had died upon the leaden frames of the stained glass window. Only when the cell was cloaked in near total darkness, save for the faint silver light of the rising moon, did she light a single tallow candle. The small flame fought against the oppressive gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar objects of her cell seem strange and menacing. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, the rustle of her habit the only sound to break the profound silence that had fallen once more upon the priory. Her fingers, gnarled by age but still steady, finally closed around the leather pouch. The skin was cool and supple, and the weight within it settled heavily in her palm, a solid, undeniable burden. She brought it closer to the candlelight, her expression unreadable in the flickering glow. With a slow, methodical pull, she untied the leather thong that bound it shut. The knot gave way with a soft sigh, releasing a faint scent of metal and the unknown histories of the men who had once worn what lay inside. It was the quiet, final exhalation of a secret about to be born into the light. Inside, glinting dully in the candlelight, were not coins. There was no cheerful clatter of silver or the warm gleam of gold currency. Instead, a collection of men's rings tumbled onto the dark wood of the table, their landing a muted, heavy thud. They were signet rings, crafted for the hands of noblemen, each bearing the crest of a powerful house, a silent testament to a sin or a favor that now belonged to her. Each was a story, a life, a soul ensnared in the web she so carefully maintained from within these hallowed, and hollowed, walls. Her gaze swept over the collection of tiny, potent emblems, a boar's head here, a rampant lion there. Then her eyes settled on one in particular, and she drew in a sharp, almost imperceptible breath. It was a ring not of gold but of dark, polished stone, and carved into its surface was the unmistakable image of a falcon in flight. A symbol of lethal grace and soaring ambition, a device that could belong to only one man, a man whose lineage was tied directly to the throne of England. In that moment, the weight in her hand was no longer that of mere metal and stone, but the crushing weight of royal sin. The Priory of St. Radegunde had long since acquired a foul reputation. It clung to its stone walls like a persistent winter mist, a miasma of ill rumor that the scent of incense from the chapel could never quite disguise. To the common folk of Cambridge, the Priory was a place of shadows and whispers, an institution whose sanctity was a carefully maintained facade. They spoke of it in hushed tones at market stalls and in the smoky corners of taverns, telling tales not of piety and devotion, but of a worldliness that bordered on outright sin, a sickness that had taken root in holy ground and was slowly corrupting the very heart of the establishment. Founded centuries before as a haven of solemn prayer and quiet contemplation, by the close of the 15th century it had devolved into something else entirely. It had become a secluded repository for the unwanted daughters of noble families, a place where young women were sent not by a divine calling from God, but by the cold, pragmatic decree of fathers unwilling to spend a fortune on a suitable dowry. It was a gilded cage, where the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were spoken by lips that secretly yearned for the silks, jewels, and courtly intrigues of the world they had been forced to renounce. Behind the high, imposing walls, where only the gentle murmur of prayer and the soaring notes of sacred hymns should have been heard, other sounds now bled into the air. Laughter, sharp and brittle, would often echo across the manicured gardens, a sound devoid of true joy. Snatches of secular songs, popular ballads of love and loss, would drift from casement windows that were supposed to be shut against the temptations of the world. And at night, in the deep, watchful silence of the hallowed corridors, the floorboards would often creak and groan under the heavy tread of footsteps that did not belong to any of the sisters. Bishop John Alcock, a man of stern countenance and unyielding faith, had long been the recipient of troubling reports concerning the conduct of the nuns. These were not mere gossip, but detailed accounts delivered by sober-minded clerics and worried local officials. The letters and testimonies piled up on his desk, a growing monument of ink and parchment to the priory's decay. He was a man who saw the world in stark terms of order and chaos, of righteousness and corruption, and the tales from St. Radegund's were a profound offense to his vision of a disciplined and devout church. The whispers spoke of secret feasts held in the dead of night, where the sisters would gorge themselves on roasted meats and drink expensive wine smuggled in from the city, their laughter echoing through the refectory in mockery of their vows of abstinence. There were stories of expensive, fashionable garments of silk and velvet concealed beneath their coarse woolen habits, a constant, hidden reminder of the vanity they had sworn to forsake. These were not the actions of a few errant souls, the reports suggested, but a systemic rot that permeated the entire community, from the youngest novice to the prioress herself. And most disturbing of all were the persistent, detailed accounts of men. Visitors who arrived under the cloak of darkness, their faces hidden by shadows and hoods. They were said to be students from the nearby university, bold and reckless in their youth, or even married gentlemen of high standing, seeking a different kind of sanctuary within the priory's walls. They slipped through a little-used postern gate, left conveniently unbolted, or were ushered in by a lay servant whose loyalty had been purchased, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors of the nunnery for hours at a time, their purpose a scandalous open secret. The bishop would sit late into the night in his austere study, the candlelight flickering across the pages of these damning reports. He could almost hear the illicit laughter, smell the forbidden wine, and see the shadows of men moving where they should not be. Each new account was a fresh wound to his soul, a stain upon the honor of his diocese. He saw it not merely as a failure of discipline but as a spiritual cancer, a mockery of God's holy law that he, as the chief shepherd of this flock, was duty-bound to excise, no matter how painful the procedure might be. His jaw would tighten, and his eyes, dark and piercing, would stare into the flame as he contemplated the inevitable storm he would have to unleash. The bishop, resolved to unearth the truth that festered behind the priory's serene facade, initiated his own inquiry, one that would move in shadows and speak in whispers. He bypassed the formal channels of the church, knowing they were ponderous and prone to leaks that would alert his quarry. Instead, he dispatched his own men, individuals chosen for their obscurity and keen senses. They were humble scribes with eyes that missed nothing, and quiet lay servants whose unassuming presence allowed them to move through the world unnoticed. Their task was to listen, to gather the threads of rumor and fact from the villages and fields surrounding St. Radegund's. For weeks, his agents immersed themselves in the life of the countryside. They shared ale with farmers in smoky taverns, their questions about crop yields slowly giving way to inquiries about the goings-on at the great priory on the hill. They haggled with merchants in the bustling Cambridge market, their discussions of the price of wool and wine subtly turning to the unusually rich tastes of the nuns. They sat with beggars by the roadside, sharing a crust of bread in exchange for stories from those who watched the world from its lowest vantage point, seeing the comings and goings that respectable folk were trained to ignore. At first, the tales they gathered were disjointed, colored by a deep-seated fear of the church's power. The local peasants spoke reluctantly, their eyes darting about as if the very stones might report their words. They complained of the nuns' arrogance, of their demands for the finest produce, and of a general air of worldliness that sat ill with their sacred vows. The stories were vague, hinting at a spiritual sickness rather than outright sin, a foundation of discontent upon which more terrible truths might be built. The fear was a wall, but the agents knew that with patience, every wall could be breached. Gradually, as trust was carefully cultivated, the whispers grew bolder and the picture they painted became horrifyingly clear. The merchants, men of commerce less intimidated by ecclesiastical authority, spoke more freely. They described late-night deliveries of goods that had no place in a convent, bolts of French silk, casks of expensive Rhine wine, and exotic spices worth a small fortune. They spoke of seeing men, their features obscured by the hoods of their fine cloaks, being admitted through a side gate long after the hour of Compline, when the priory should have been locked in silent prayer and slumber for the night. The most chilling accounts, however, came from the margins of society. A vagrant who often slept in the ditch near the priory's orchard wall spoke of sounds that haunted his nights. He described hearing not the chanting of psalms, but the strains of secular music played on a lute, and bursts of loud, unrestrained laughter. More than once, he claimed to have heard the faint, desperate wail of a newborn child coming from within the walls, a sound that would last for a few nights before being abruptly and permanently silenced. The silence that followed, he said, was the most unnerving sound of all. Another story surfaced from an elderly woman who had served in the priory's kitchens as a young girl. With a trembling voice, she recounted the disappearance of several young novices over the years. These were vibrant, sometimes defiant girls, sent to the convent against their will. The official explanation was always plausible: a sudden, virulent fever had taken them, or they had been transferred to a more remote, stricter convent for spiritual correction. Yet no grieving family ever came to claim a body, and no word was ever heard from the girls again. They simply vanished from the world, their existence erased as if they had never been. Every story, every fragmented account, eventually led back to the prioress. She emerged from the tapestry of whispers not as a spiritual guide, but as a formidable and feared matriarch. She was said to rule the priory with an iron hand, her authority absolute and unquestioned. She maintained discipline not through piety, but through a shrewd understanding of the secrets her nuns harbored. Furthermore, the villagers spoke of the lavish gifts she received from powerful noblemen, patrons whose names were only ever uttered with a mixture of awe and terror, men who clearly paid for more than just prayers for their souls. The agents found that this was the final, insurmountable barrier. While people would talk of the nuns' excesses, of the midnight feasts and the unsettling sounds, they would fall deathly silent when asked to name the priory's powerful visitors. Their faces would pale, and they would make the sign against evil, convinced that to speak such names aloud was to invite ruin, or worse. It became terrifyingly clear to the bishop's men that the prioress was not merely presiding over a corrupt house of God, she was the gatekeeper to a hidden world of aristocratic vice, a broker of secrets for the most powerful men in the land. The agents returned to Bishop Alcock not with a collection of village gossip, but with a horrifyingly coherent dossier. They had cross-referenced the timelines of the merchant's deliveries with the nights the vagrant heard music. They had noted the correlation between the arrival of certain patrons and the subsequent disappearance of a troublesome novice. The puzzle was far from complete, but the image it formed was one of profound and systemic corruption. It was a chronicle of gluttony, lust, and greed, and beneath it all, the dark, unspoken possibility of infanticide and murder, all flourishing under the sanctified roof of the priory of St. Radegund. Bishop Alcock's visitation crashed upon the priory with the unheralded violence of the first winter thunderstorm. There was no formal announcement, no procession of liveried servants and chanting acolytes to signal his approach. He came at the gray hour of dawn, when the mist still clung to the river and the world was hushed and sleeping. He arrived not with the customary pomp and ceremony befitting his office, but as an instrument of judgment, a surgeon coming to cut away a deep and spreading cancer. This lack of pageantry was in itself a statement, a calculated cruelty designed to inspire fear before he had even spoken a word. His entourage was small, functional, and utterly devoid of spiritual comfort. He was accompanied by two of his most trusted senior clerics, men whose faces were etched with the same grim piety as his own, their eyes cold and assessing. More terrifyingly, he was escorted by a detachment of a dozen men-at-arms, their leather jacks creaking with every step, their steel caps catching the pale morning light. They were a brutal, worldly intrusion in a place supposedly devoted to peace. The guards moved with a grim efficiency, securing the main gate and the postern doors, their presence transforming the sanctuary into a prison in a matter of moments. The great bell in the priory's tower began to toll, not with the gentle, rhythmic call to matins or vespers, but with a harsh, frantic, and insistent clamor that shattered the morning's peace. It was a sound of alarm, a summons that spoke of crisis and catastrophe. The nuns, roused from their cells, hurried along the cold stone corridors, their initial sleepy confusion quickly curdling into a raw, palpable fear. They were herded not into the chapel for prayer, but into the vast, chilly space of the refectory. There, under the impassive gaze of a painted Christ on the far wall, they were made to wait in a brittle, terrified silence. When the last of the sisters had been assembled, a sea of black and white habits and pale, frightened faces, Bishop Alcock entered. He strode to the high table, his clerics flanking him like stone gargoyles, the guards standing impassively along the walls. He surveyed the women before him, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a moment on the prioress, who stood slightly apart, her expression a mask of cold, imperious fury. A few of the younger novices were openly weeping, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The older nuns stood rigid, their hands clutching their rosaries so tightly their knuckles were white. The prioress took a step forward, her voice sharp and clear, attempting to seize control. She spoke of a terrible misunderstanding, of malicious slander spread by enemies of their holy order. But the bishop raised a single hand, and the torrent of her words died in her throat. He did not deign to argue or debate. He had not come to listen to their bleating chorus of denials, their well-rehearsed lies and protestations of innocence. He had come to deliver a verdict that had already been decided, a judgment sealed by the weight of the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but low and resonant, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. His words did not thunder with righteous anger, they fell like chips of ice into the profound quiet, each one a separate, painful impact. He spoke of the sacred vows they had taken before God, vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. He spoke of the trust that had been placed in them, to live as beacons of piety in a fallen world. He painted a picture of what St. Radegun's was meant to be, a haven of prayer and contemplation, a spiritual fortress against the temptations of the flesh. Then, his tone hardening, he began to describe what it had become. He spoke of their vows of poverty, mocked by the secret caches of silks and jewels, and the gluttonous feasts held in the dead of night. He spoke of their vows of obedience, shattered by a culture of defiance and secrecy, orchestrated by a prioress who served her own appetites rather than God's will. His words were precise and damning, stripping away the veneer of their holiness layer by layer, exposing the rotten core beneath. He did not name names or list specific sins, but his general accusations were so laden with detail that many of the nuns flinched as if struck. And finally, he spoke of the most sacred vow of all, the vow of chastity. He spoke of the sanctity of their consecrated bodies, which they had profaned. He spoke of the house of God, which they had systematically transformed into a den of corruption and lechery, a common brothel for the decadent sons of the gentry. He spoke of the shadows of men slipping through the corridors at night, and of the sacred silence of the cloister being broken by the grunts and whispers of carnal sin. He called them not brides of Christ, but whores of Babylon, who had sold their souls for worldly pleasures and noble favors. A collective gasp, a sound of pure horror, swept through the refectory. The full, awful weight of their predicament was finally crashing down upon them. This was not a reprimand. This was an exorcism. The bishop paused, letting the weight of his condemnation settle into the very stones of the room. He looked at their faces, some contorted with shame, others frozen in shock, a few still burning with sullen defiance. He saw no true repentance, only the terror of discovery. His face remained a mask of cold, righteous certainty. He raised his voice for the first and only time, the words ringing out like a final, immutable judgment. He declared that, by the authority vested in him by God and the Holy See, he found every last one of them to be spiritually corrupt and irredeemably unfit to continue in their holy service. Their oaths were rendered meaningless, their community a blasphemy. Therefore, he announced, the priory of St. Radegund, after centuries of prayer and history, was to be dissolved, its charter revoked, its buildings and lands to be seized and repurposed for a more godly end. Their world, in that single, terrible moment, had ceased to exist. With the bishop's judgment delivered, a cold and methodical violation of the priory began. The men-at-arms, no longer mere sentinels, became instruments of a brutal inquisition, their heavy boots echoing on flagstones that had only ever known the soft tread of sandals. They moved with a detached efficiency, ransacking the nunnery from the deepest, wine-stained cellars to the bell tower where pigeons nested in dusty silence. The nuns were confined to the chapel, their prayers now frantic, desperate pleas, their sobs and whispers a stark counterpoint to the sounds of splintering wood and heavy objects being thrown aside. Every sacred space was systematically profaned by this grim, searching tide. In the cellars, hidden behind a false wall of loosely stacked barrels, they found the priory's secret treasury of gluttony. There were not just a few bottles of altar wine, but great casks of French claret and sweet German Riesling, enough to keep a wealthy lord's table supplied for a year. Alongside the wine were wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, smoked hams hanging from hooks, and clay jars filled with exotic spices from the east. This was the hoard of a sybaritic household, not a community sworn to poverty and simple fare. The guards exchanged grim, knowing looks, the rumors had not even hinted at the scale of this indulgence. The search of the nuns' individual cells revealed a different, more personal kind of corruption. Behind the crucifixes and the simple wooden cots, they uncovered the vanities of a secular world the sisters had supposedly forsaken. In a hollowed-out section of a mattress, one soldier found a gown of deep crimson silk, its fabric impossibly soft and fine. In the false bottom of a novice's dowry chest, they discovered a silver-backed mirror and small pots of rouge and kohl. These were not the possessions of brides of Christ, but the hidden treasures of courtesans, cherished in secret defiance of their vows. As they moved from cell to cell, the sheer volume of these discoveries painted a picture of systemic, deeply ingrained worldliness. It was not the failing of one or two weak-willed women, but the accepted culture of the house. They found combs carved from ivory, shoes with fine leather soles utterly unsuited for the cloister, and even small, secular books of poetry, their pages filled with romantic verse. The priory was a gilded cage, and the nuns had spent years smuggling in feathers of every color to line their nests, forgetting that their souls were meant to have already taken flight to heaven. In the scriptorium, a place that should have been dedicated to the meticulous copying of God's word, the search yielded the most damning evidence of their spiritual decay. Tucked within the pages of beautifully illuminated psalters and weighty leather-bound Bibles were letters. Dozens of them. They were written on fine, sometimes scented, parchment, in the elegant, confident script of educated noblemen. They were not letters of spiritual guidance or patronage, but passionate, explicit, and often blasphemous declarations of love and lust, chronicling the assignations that took place within these very walls. One guard, a man who could read, took one of the letters to his captain. The script spoke of a divine angel, with eyes like the evening star, and a body more sacred than any relic. It detailed a clandestine meeting in the chapel itself, before the high altar, a place of ultimate sanctity chosen for a profane tryst. The act of hiding these confessions of carnal sin within the pages of the Holy Bible was a sacrilege so profound that even the hardened soldiers were momentarily silenced by it. The letters were a detailed ledger of the priory's descent into a high-class brothel. When the main buildings had been thoroughly stripped of their secrets, the bishop, his face a mask of stone, led the way outside. The nuns were brought out from the chapel and made to stand under the gray, unforgiving sky. His gaze fell upon the prioress's private garden, a meticulously kept square of land that was her personal sanctuary. It was an oasis of order, with neat rows of medicinal herbs, fragrant lavender bushes, and a single, magnificent rose arbor. The prioress was ordered to accompany him, her face impassive, her head held high as she walked beside the man who was destroying her world. The bishop walked slowly through the garden, his eyes scanning the ground, until he stopped before a large, gnarled thorn bush. It was an ancient, ugly thing, mostly dead, its tangled, leafless branches clawing at the air like the skeletal fingers of a condemned man. It stood in stark contrast to the cultivated beauty of the rest of the garden. The bishop looked at the prioress, a silent question in his eyes, but she returned his gaze without a flicker of emotion. Then, he turned to two of his guards. "Dig here," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. The men exchanged a look of confusion but obeyed, fetching spades from the tool shed. The ground was soft and loamy, easy to turn. The prioress stood motionless, a statue in a black habit, watching the men work. The only sounds were the rhythmic scrape and plunge of the shovels and the nervous breathing of the assembled nuns. The air grew thick with a terrible, unspoken anticipation. The hole grew deeper, a dark wound opened in the heart of the beautiful garden, and still, the prioress did not move, her composure a shield of impenetrable ice. Then, one of the shovels struck something with a dull, sickening crack. It was not the sound of metal on stone. The guard knelt, his face grim, and reached into the loose earth. He pulled his hand back, holding something small, white, and unmistakably a bone. It was tiny, impossibly delicate, the rib of an infant. A collective, horrified gasp went through the crowd of nuns. The guard dropped the bone as if it had burned him, his face pale with shock and revulsion. The bishop simply nodded, his worst suspicions confirmed. "Continue," he ordered. What followed was a descent into a nightmare. The first bone was followed by another, and another. Soon, the guards were not digging so much as carefully unearthing a dense, tangled layer of skeletal remains. They were the bones of newborns, dozens of them, their tiny forms jumbled together in the dark earth. It was not a burial ground, it was a dumping pit, a silent, horrific testament to the years of secret births and the cold-blooded disposal of their unwanted fruit. The garden's fragrant herbs and beautiful roses had been nourished by the remains of murdered infants. The guards, now working with a grim reverence, began to lay the tiny skeletons out on a piece of sailcloth. The sight was beyond horrific. Skulls no bigger than a man's fist, delicate spines like strings of pearls, and ribcages so small they looked like the carcasses of birds. The sheer number was staggering, far more than could be attributed to a single, tragic mistake. This was evidence of a systematic, ongoing slaughterhouse, a place where the consequences of sin were buried and forgotten. The scale of the depravity finally broke the composure of the younger nuns, whose wails of terror now filled the air. The prioress, however, remained silent and still, forced to bear witness to the exhumation of her darkest secrets. Her face was a void, her eyes fixed on the growing collection of bones on the cloth. She showed no remorse, no fear, no grief. Her expression was one of profound, chilling detachment, as if she were observing a mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant agricultural procedure. It was the face of a monster who had long ago cut out her own conscience and buried it deeper than any of the bodies. One of the guards, his hands trembling with a mixture of anger and nausea, fumbled as he lifted a particularly intact skeleton from the pit. The tiny skull, fragile as a bird's egg, slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground, landing with a soft, final thud on the damp earth. It rolled a few inches and came to rest near the hem of the prioress's habit. At that precise moment, and only for a heartbeat, her composure cracked. Her lips, which had been a thin, straight line, compressed into a white, bloodless seam. It was not a look of horror, but of pure, cold fury. An infinitesimal tightening, a flicker of irritation that her meticulous, orderly garden of death had been so clumsily disturbed. The end came with the chilling finality of a judge's sentence, delivered not by one voice, but by two of the most powerful on earth. By royal decree and papal bull, in the year of our Lord 1496, the Priory of St. Radegund was officially declared defunct. The words, read aloud from a scroll in the Priory's now empty chapel, were a masterpiece of legal and spiritual condemnation, speaking of a corruption so profound that the very stones were deemed tainted. The name of St. Radegund was formally erased from the rolls of the Holy Houses of England, its history of sin sealed and its future cancelled by the joint authority of Crown and Church. The Priory's extensive lands, its fertile fields and profitable mills, along with the desecrated buildings themselves, were granted to a new and hopeful enterprise. Bishop Alcock, having purged the sickness, now sought to build something pure in its place. The grounds were to become the foundation for a new seat of learning, Jesus College, a place where young men would be trained in piety and scholarship, their prayers and studies intended to cleanse the very air of its recent pollutions. The sounds of scandalous laughter and secret music were soon to be replaced by the earnest drone of Latin declensions and theological debate, a deliberate act of sanctified replacement. The nuns, the fallen brides of Christ, were scattered to the winds. No longer a community, they were now individual prisoners, their collective shame broken down into solitary penance. They were dispatched in small, guarded groups, sent to other, far more austere and remote convents across the land. These were places of genuine discipline, where the rule was iron, the food was meager, and the prayers were long and arduous. They were sent to be forgotten, to live out the remainder of their days in cold cells, scrubbing stone floors and contemplating the magnitude of their sins in a silence broken only by the tolling of the bell for penance. But the prioress, the architect of this fallen kingdom, was to avoid this fate of slow, living burial. On the final night, as she awaited the morning cart that would transport her to a fortified nunnery in the desolate north, she was locked securely in her own cell. Two of the bishop's most trusted guards were posted directly outside her door, a heavy oak barrier with a new iron lock. They were ordered to let no one in or out, and to listen for any sound. The night was cold and still, and the guards passed the long hours in watchful silence, confident that their charge was as secure as any prisoner in the Tower of London. When the pale light of dawn crept through the high window, the captain of the guard arrived to escort the prioress on her journey. He unlocked the heavy door and pushed it open, ready to face the cold defiance of his prisoner one last time. But the cell was empty. The simple cot was undisturbed, the air still and cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken furniture, no forced window. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the morning mist. The guards outside swore on their immortal souls that the door had not been opened and that they had heard nothing, not so much as a sigh, from within the room all night. A frantic, thorough search immediately ensued. The men-at-arms, furious at having been outwitted, swarmed through the priory and its grounds. They checked every room, every cupboard, every dark corner of the cellars. They scoured the surrounding woods and dragged the nearby river, their efforts yielding nothing but mud and tangled weeds. The prioress had vanished from a locked room, leaving behind not a single clue to the method of her escape or her destination. She was gone. And with her, gone forever, were the secrets of the most powerful and compromised men in the Kingdom of England. Years turned into decades. The scandal of St. Radgun slowly faded from living memory into a dark local legend. The stones of the old priory were repurposed, its walls incorporated into the new, thriving Jesus College. The sound of scholarly life filled the halls where the nuns had once whispered and sinned. The Garden of Bones was dug up, consecrated, and turned into a peaceful fellows' garden, its horrific past buried under a new layer of topsoil and respectability. The world moved on, and the story of the corrupt prioress became little more than a cautionary tale told to frighten unruly novices. Then, many years later, during a series of renovations to what had once been the prioress's private quarters, a group of stonemasons made a startling discovery. While tapping along a solid interior wall, searching for structural weakness, one of the workers heard a strange, hollow echo where there should have been solid stone. Intrigued, they took their crowbars and hammers to the plaster, chipping away at the surface. Behind the plaster and a layer of newer brickwork, they uncovered the unmistakable outline of a sealed, hidden doorway, mortared shut with an expertise that had rendered it invisible for generations. With considerable effort, they broke through the bricked-up entrance. It opened into a narrow, suffocatingly dark passage, thick with the dust of ages and the scent of cold, damp earth. Lighting torches, the workmen cautiously ventured inside. It was a secret tunnel, expertly cut, sloping gently downwards, away from the college and deep into the ground. They followed its winding path for what felt like a great distance, the air growing colder and damper with every step, until they finally saw a faint glimmer of light ahead of them. The passage ended at a small, heavily overgrown opening, concealed from the outside by a thick curtain of ivy and brambles. It emerged low on the bank of the river Cam, far beyond the old priory walls, a hidden exit to the world that would have been completely invisible from both the land and the water. This was how she had escaped. It was a path built with foresight and immense resources, a secret lifeline prepared long in advance for the day her kingdom would inevitably fall. She had not been a prisoner awaiting her fate, she had been a queen awaiting her moment to abdicate. But it was not the passage itself that was the most remarkable discovery. Just inside the entrance, lying in the thick dust of the tunnel floor, were two small, abandoned items. The first was a single woman's shoe. It was not the simple leather sandal of a nun, but a delicate, pointed slipper made of the finest doeskin, its surface exquisitely embroidered with dozens of tiny, shimmering pearls. It was a shoe made for the foot of a noble lady, a final, discarded symbol of the wealth and secret life she had once commanded. Beside the shoe lay a small, tattered scrap of parchment. It was yellowed with age and stiff with damp, and for a moment the workmen thought it would crumble to dust at their touch. But one man, the most careful among them, lifted it gently. On its surface, written in a confident, elegant, and unmistakably feminine hand, was a single word, inscribed in faded brown ink. It was not a confession, nor a plea for mercy, nor a curse upon her enemies. It was a declaration. The word was, free.